As for 60 minutes, is designated the minority leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, one of the great joys of representing Louisville in the House of Representatives is that I get to constantly claim that I represent Muhammad Ali and the home of Muhammad Ali. It has always been a source of pride, not just to me, but to all of my fellow Louisvillians, that we could say that the Louisville Lip, the greatest of all time, called Louisville home. Now, one of the brightest lights in the world has extinguished. Muhammad Ali passed away last Friday after a long and courageous battle with Parkinson's disease. And the world has experienced a collective grief period. The joy of his accomplishments, the recognition of his commitment to peace, to tolerance, to respect, to love. All of those things have come from all over the world. So tonight, some of my colleagues and I have come to the floor to talk about Muhammad Ali, his life, his legacy, personal stories, the impact that he's had on our lives and on this country's life and on the world. He will be laid to rest this Friday in Louisville. Former President Clinton will eulogize him, and many leaders from around the world will be there to pay their respects. But I go back many, many years. When I was 16 years old, living in Louisville, having watched him, then Cassius Clay, an 8-1 underdog, upset the great, terrifying Sonny Liston in Miami, and then going to the airport the next day to welcome him home. I stood outside the airport. There weren't a lot of people there that day. And as Cassius Clay emerged from that terminal and looked around and drew himself up, I said, I had never seen a more beautiful human specimen in my life. So when he called himself not just the greatest of all time, but the prettiest of all time, I was not going to argue with him. Of course, I wasn't going to argue with him about much. But that was my first personal exposure to Muhammad Ali. He was a man who gained fame in a violent game, but he earned his immortality as a kind, gentle, and caring soul. And in the later years, when I got to know him better and spent more time around him, that's the one thing that always came through: his wonderful soul. I don't know that I've ever known a person or seen a person who got more joy out of making a child smile as Muhammad Ali. And there was never a time when he was in the presence of children when he didn't make an effort to stop, joke with them, play with them. That was a source of incredible joy for him. So as we remember Muhammad Ali tonight, we remember not just his boxing prowess, we remember the courage he showed outside the ring. Coming of age in a very, very turbulent period in American history, during the civil rights demonstrations, when America was experiencing a convulsion over how to deal with the issue of race. And then the Vietnam War, a war whose opposition Ali paid a dear price for. In 1967, refusing to be drafted into the armed services, knowing that it would cost him his boxing career, understanding that he might well go to jail and never fight again, but willing to stand for principles. And in doing that, I think turned a country around, made them view the Vietnam War in a different light. It wouldn't have happened but for Muhammad Ali. He was not the only one, of course, but he was the most prominent one. Later, who can forget lighting that torch in the Atlanta Olympics in 1996? Shaking from the Parkinson's disease that he had, but inspiring millions. And again, making a statement about disabilities that meant so much to so many. So tonight, as we hear from various members about Muhammad Ali, I think what will come through is not just, again, his skill as an athlete, but his contributions as a citizen of the world and someone who has left a lasting legacy, not just on people's lives individually, but on civilization as a whole. And with that, I would like to yield to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. I want to thank you for putting together this hour. I think it's important that we recognize icons in our society and people who've contributed so much, as you well expressed, to American culture and to the thinking in our country about war, about race, and about people with disabilities. That's three very, very major areas that Muhammad Ali had a great impact on. You related back to when you were 16 years old, and I was not quite 15 years old. And at that time, my family, we had moved to Coral Gables, Florida, and lived there from 61 to 64. Really during that period, that was Muhammad Ali's second home, was Miami Beach in the Fifth Street Gym. And so during that period when Ali was Cassius Clay, had won the Olympic gold medal, when I remember him winning the Olympic gold medal in 60 at Rome, his professional career started, and he might probably started in Louisville, but he was quickly in Miami Beach fighting. And so he was on the news all the time in Miami Beach and Clore Mosier's sports show and whoever else, but always on TV and a personality in Miami Beach. So my granddad gave me $20, which was a lot of money, on February the 25th, if I remember, 1964, and I went to that fight. And I was sitting probably in the highest seat in the Miami Beach Convention Center and watching that fight by myself. My dad wasn't so much into it, but my grandfather gave me that $20, and I went to it. And I've got my ducat. It's a great-looking Clay Liston ticket in good shape, and a couple of programs from that event, which I'm proud to have. And I've been a fan of his, and I know how much of a impact he had on our world. You know, I was also a boxing fan of Floyd Patterson's, and Floyd Patterson was a previous champion. And the first time that Floyd fought Muhammad Ali, I have to admit I was cheering for Floyd. Floyd didn't do too well. He hurt his back, and Floyd was taunted by Ali and wanted him to say his name, and he punished him pretty good through 12 rounds. But the second time they fought, which was in the early 70s, Patterson did a lot better. They stopped the fight, I think, at the beginning, into the 6th or the beginning of the 7th, and it was closer to even. And after the fight, as I understand it, Ali told the referee not to stop the fight. He says, because Patterson's fighting so well and he should be able to continue fighting, and it wasn't fair to stop it. And I saw an interview with then Cassius Clay with Steve Allen from 1963 that's on the internet. And in that interview, they said something about Floyd Patterson. And first, Clay made a joke, and he said that, you know, Liston had knocked him out twice in one round, and Floyd's jaw was somewhat challenged. And he said that his legs should sue his body for lack of support. And then he kind of stopped and he laughed and chuckled and he said, "No, I shouldn't have said that. I really like Floyd." Of course, that was before Floyd didn't recognize his new name. But Louisville was the home of Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali. And one of the great attractions in Louisville is the Muhammad Ali Center, which I've had the opportunity to visit and go through, and you can sit and watch all of Ali's fights, any one of them, sit in a chair and push a button, and there it is, and just watch any fight. I watched that second Patterson-Ali fight. Floyd was doing pretty good through those 6 rounds. But it's more than for boxing. It's a center, and it's about what he did for children. There's a lot of displays about what he did for children and what he did for peace and his efforts around the world. And I think that's the great thing about Muhammad Ali. They didn't build a boxing museum. They built a center about all of his desires for freedoms and for helping people around the globe and showing we're all one. And as he said, I think it was back in January of this year, that his religion, Islam, was not about San Bernardino and Brussels or Paris or any other place there have been attacks, that Islam was a religion of love, and it shouldn't be seen that way, and it's not the religion he knew. And that anybody who thought it was that way and wanted to discriminate against people based on their religion were wrong, because it wasn't that type of religion. So he was still up to, this year, taking positions of conscience to try to steer people in the right direction. I keep under my glass in my office desk, a quote from Muhammad Ali. It's on a postcard that I got at the Muhammad Ali Center. And it shows Muhammad Ali in the ring, kind of dancing around. And it says, "The fight is won or lost away from witnesses, behind the lines, in the gym, and out there on the road, long before I dance under those lights." And it made me think about what we do in politics. Our elections are generally not won. If you're serious about your job and your constituents, right before elections. It's done during your term of office, and what you do for your constituents and how you vote and what you do for folks, which is the same thing as a fighter being out there in the gym and on the road doing road work and hitting the bag and training. So Ali is with me. This is what I will look at when I sit down right underneath my desk, and I see that, and he kind of guides me, and he guides everybody in that way. If you think about it, that's what life's about, is preparation and having a plan and taking action to implement that plan. But I know Mr. Larson of Connecticut wants to share, and if it's all right with you, Mr. Yarmouth, can we yield to Mr. Larson?
I think we can yield to Mr. Larson from Connecticut.
Well, thank you. I thank the gentleman from Memphis, and I especially thank the gentleman from Louisville for organizing this special order this evening. I can't think of an athlete who more impacted my life and certainly the lives of people in our generation. The gentleman for Louisville started in 1960, or I forget, or maybe it was you started when you were 16. But watching then Cassius Marcellus Clay in the 1960 Olympics in Rome, a legendary Olympics that produced so many highlights of American athleticism, from Bob Hayes to Rayford Johnson, and of course, this young, boyish-looking but eloquent and masterful heavyweight that moved like nothing else I had ever seen or would ever see since. I used to watch my father worked 3 jobs, and about the only time he was home on a Friday night, we'd watch the Gillette Sports Hour, which was the boxing matches that would occur. My dad loved to follow boxing, and he was a big Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano fan. And of course, my dad's generation, when Cassius Marcellus Clay came along, were not happy with his poetry and braggadocio manner. As a kid, we thought it was the coolest thing. And I would always remind my dad that he never made a boast that his fists couldn't back up. And the poetry, well, he was ahead of his time in terms of rap, but he also was ahead of his time in terms of what he brought to the sport. And as the distinguished gentleman from Louisville pointed out, when he stepped into the ring with Sonny Liston, we all feared for his life. But as it turned out, that speed and that endurance and his incredible skills, that he did everything that a boxer shouldn't do, but was able to do it because of exceptional ability. How do I know this? We're fortunate to have in this chamber somebody who was in the ring with Muhammad Ali. And he was in the ring with him, Sonny Liston, and Joe Frazier. Bob Brady of Philadelphia was a sparring partner and used in the ring. As you all know, Bob Brady's a pretty big guy, and he also can move. Maybe doesn't look so nowadays, but he still looks pretty fierce. I wouldn't want to get in the ring with Bob Brady. But I asked him once to explain what that must have been like, and he was dear friends with Joe Frazier. And he said, but you wouldn't get in a ring with Sonny Liston unless you had a lot of people around you, because he said he was the meanest person he ever met or got in the ring in his life. And I said, well, what about Muhammad Ali? He said, there is nothing like him. He said he was a freak. I said, what do you mean, a freak? He said, a freak of nature, because what he was able to do with his speed, with his grace, and the simplistic thing of just being able to move away from a punch. Skills that when you watch these films today, you're in awe of them. I can remember coming in and talking about the Ali Shuffle when we saw him do that against Cooper in England. No one had ever seen anything like that. And when he came back and he got in the ring and when he would dance, you just knew that he was going to win. The confidence that he always exuded. And then, as John Yarmouth pointed out, he became so much bigger than the sport itself because of his conviction, and did it during a tumultuous time. The 60s will probably go down and forever be remembered as a great crucible for the history of this country, when converging at the same time were the civil rights movement, an education movement that was spawned by the launching of Sputnik, the civil rights movement that also spawned the anti-war movement, that spawned the women's movement, that spawned the ecological movement, all came about during this tumultuous times. And who was one of the leaders, probably the most recognized face in America, beyond perhaps John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, was Muhammad Ali. And he brought so much more because of his conviction. I remember my experience of meeting him for the first time in East Hartford, Connecticut, working at Woodland Auto Body, putting tire black on cars. If you ever had that luxurious duty, you would not appreciate it. And all of a sudden, this gold Toronado pulled in to Woodland Auto Body. Now, most of the people who worked at Woodland Auto Body were of African-American lineage. And when I saw this Toronado pull in, and if you know anything about a Toronado, it has one long window. And when they rolled down the window, there was Boondini Brown. And he said, do you know how to get to WINF radio station? And I said, well, yes, sir. It's just up the street here. And I looked in the back, and there was Muhammad Ali. And I said, the champ. I said, wait right here. And I went inside because I knew my coworkers, who certainly enjoyed seeing me have to put tire black on cars. I came running in and I said, Muhammad Ali's out here. The champ is here. And they looked at me and said, yeah, right. And Santa Claus is coming also. But they came out, and emerging from this gold Toronado was this unbelievably gracious human being, and of course at 6'3", certainly towering above me, and even amongst some of the brothers who were out there talking, but we couldn't believe that he was actually there in our midst. And if you believe about a certain aura that people have around them, he had it. He was given a gift, and he used it. And that picture that appeared in the New York Times with so many athletes of the period, the legendary Jim Brown and Bill Russell, all sitting at that table, understanding what this youthful but spiritual individual had done, not just for Black America, but what he did for the world in terms of speaking truth to power. I will always remember that grace and elegance and rooting for him, and even being scared to death in the rumble in the jungle that George Foreman might do him harm, and said, oh my God, why is he doing hanging on the ropes, which later became famous for rope-a-dope. But he was the most unique athlete that I've ever observed in my life. And beyond that unique talent that he brought to the ring and those skills that he brought to bear with unprecedented grace and ability, he also made the world a better place. And as the chairman, as the gentleman from Louisville pointed out, and distinguished himself far beyond what he accomplished in the ring by his simple pleas to America. I was so happy to see him in his later years atone for some of the cruel things he had said during his life to Joe Frazier and to other people, and some of the taunts that he did. And it just showed the depth and the character of someone we so admired. And I thank the gentleman so much for allowing me the opportunity to share that reminiscence about the greatest.
I thank the gentleman, and since he referenced the poetry and the fact that Muhammad Ali is sometimes actually considered the godfather of rap, I'd like to read one thing that he wrote. This is right after the Olympics in 1960. "To make America the greatest is my goal, so I beat the Russian and I beat the Pole. And for the USA won the medal of gold. Italians said, 'You're greater than the Cassius of old. We like your name, we like your game. So make Rome your home if you will.' I said, 'I appreciate the hospitality, but the USA is my country still, 'cause they're waiting to welcome me in Louisville.'" I'd now like to yield to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty.
Thank you to my colleague, Congressman Yarmuth, Mr. Speaker, to the rest of my colleagues. It is indeed an honor for me to come tonight to share in the life and the legacy of the greatest, of a champ, of Muhammad Ali. Like my colleagues, I followed his career and was mesmerized by his wit, his poetry, and more specifically, his boxing skill. But for me tonight, it was a special honor when I became a member of this United States Congress. It was during the 113th Congress and the 44th Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's annual legislative conference. During that conference, each member of the Congressional Black Caucus can submit a name of someone they think has made a difference in the lives of others, whether it was for health care, whether it was for civil rights, or making a difference through philanthropy. And as I thought about all of the individuals that I could submit, I was very proud that I submitted the name Muhammad Ali. It was even a greater honor when he received the most votes from my colleagues, and he received one of our Phoenix Awards named after Ralph Metcalfe. And so when I stood on that stage before thousands of individuals, including the President of these United States, President Barack Obama, and watched the video that his family sent because he wasn't able to attend that dinner, I sat there honored and proud because this Black man made a difference in the lives of so many young children, so many adults. And today we come here and we salute and we honor a great legacy. So I want to thank you, Congressman Yarmuth, for letting me make this small contribution. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. I'd now like to yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
I thank the gentleman from Louisville. When I heard of the greatest of all times passing, my heart was filled and heavy because he was very significant in my life. When you just think of him, and I got to meet him first as a young boy. I was about 10 years old. My dad was a professional boxer. He's one of 49 individuals to get knocked out by Rocky Marciano. But that also brought him into the area where he got to know many boxers and training, etc. he would train in the same gym in New York where Sugar Ray Robinson was and where Boudini and Youngblood, who was always in Ali's corner. So I got to see Ali, this Cassius Clay, train at an early age and fell in love with him immediately. Number one, what you could do when you saw Muhammad Ali, at that time you saw a young man who was confident. And yes, as I hear my colleagues talking about his athletic ability and skills, he had all of that. But what people, and I would like to talk about briefly tonight, what was the highest of esteem for Muhammad Ali was his brain. There is nothing that Ali did that he didn't think about. Everything that he did, there was a reason for it. When he first saw this wrestler and how people hated him, this George guy, and he saw how all the people were coming to watch and paying all of their money because they were talking, he was talking, except he said, here's a good way to promote myself and to make sure that we can make some money. And so he did that. And then he thought about calling and naming the round that he was calling people in and all of that, and so he did all of those things, but there was a reason for it. He was a promoter. He knew what it took. People at that time, many of them wanted to go see the Louisville Lip shut up, but at each time he would win. What I just want to say about Ali, though, his brain and his heart. His brain and his heart, because throughout my lifetime, I had several times to be with him and to get to know him a little bit. I'll just, for brevity of time, talk about one real quick. I can recall, I used to drive him at times when he was in New York. And so I'd get in the car, and he'd get in the car, and of course, he's the funniest guy in the world, and he'd be telling jokes and doing everything else. So we were driving down a street in Brooklyn, New York. I remember it like it was yesterday. I stopped at a light. And all of a sudden, Muhammad's looking around, he jumps out of the car. He jumps, there were some kids on the corner. And he jumps out and he goes and he starts shadow boxing with them. And the kids look up, oh, the champ is here, the champ is here. And he would just talk to them. Then it was encouraging them to go to school, encouraging them to do good things. And I know, because when you listen to all of the stories afterwards, individuals were giving personal stories. Never would you see an individual as popular, as well known as Ali, where individuals could actually talk about a personal story, because Ali wasn't one that was hid behind bodyguards or this one or that one. He was one that always wanted to be the man on the streets involved with people to make a difference in their life. He set an example for individuals. And so I think of the example too, because they're sides of Ali. You know, I heard someone talking about the Rumble in the Jungle. I used to go up to the camp and watch him train and dealate. And I was there when he was training for George Foreman. I was there, stayed up there for about a week. And then there, again, talk about consciousness, he had these huge rocks talking about all of the great African-American fighters before him, because he never forgot who he was or where he came from. But he had these rocks there, and he was in the gym training. And I can remember he would get up on the ropes, and he'd put his hands up, and Angelo Dundee would be, get off the ropes, champ, get off the ropes, get off those ropes, champ, you're gonna get killed on those ropes. And about, the second round training, he did this, he went over and said to Angelo, shut up, I know what I'm doing. Nobody knew what he was doing, but he knew what he was doing. He always outthought everyone. He outthought them. That was the key to this thing. The greatest of all time. And so, Ali, I say this, because I remember you saying this one time to someone. If you want some gin, I'll get you in 10. If you like wine, it'll be round number 9. If you think you're great, you'll fall in 8. If you want to go to heaven, it'll be round number 7. But if you want to mix, I'll get you in 6. Talk that jive, you'll fall in 5. If you want to go like old Moore, I'll get you in 4. Mess with me, I'll reduce it to 3. If that won't do, you'll fall in 2. If the crowd wants some fun, you'll fall in 1. Why? Because I float like a butterfly and I sting like a bee. That's why nobody messed with Muhammad Ali. Ali, we love you. We thank you for your contribution, not only to Louisville, not only to the United States of America, not only to African Americans and to Africa, but to every place on this planet. You are indeed God's gift to this great planet. We thank God for your life and times. You will live on forever as the greatest of all time and the prettiest.
I thank the gentleman, and I'd now like to yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yarmouth, for yielding time this evening. I am absolutely embarrassed to come after my friend, Congressman Greg Meeks. Why in the world would you put me on the schedule to come to the podium at this very moment? But thank you in any event for your friendship. Thank you for your extraordinary leadership. I was in your hometown of Louisville, Kentucky a few weeks ago and absolutely enjoyed going to church with you and meeting many of your friends there in Louisville. You are a great member of this body, and I thank you so very much. But Mr. Speaker, I stand with Congressman Meeks and Congressman Cohen and all of my colleagues today to recognize and to remember a great American, a true American hero. We honor, we remember this extraordinary life and the accomplishments and the countless contributions of Muhammad Ali. Born just 5 years before me in 1942 in Louisville, Kentucky, Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. was born to Cassius Marcellus Clay and Mrs. Odessa Lee Grady Clay. Those were his parents. On March 6, 1964, when I was a junior in high school, after joining the Nation of Islam, Cassius Clay became known as Muhammad Ali. Mr. Cohen, I remember it like it was yesterday. His interest in boxing began at the age of 12 after he reported a stolen bicycle to a local police officer named Joe Martin, who was also a boxing trainer. In 1959, Muhammad Ali was the National Golden Gloves Light Heavyweight Champion and National Amateur Athletic Union Champion. After winning his first 19 fights, and that was absolutely incredible, winning his first 19 fights, including 15 knockouts, Muhammad Ali defeated Sonny Liston on February 25, 1964, to become the world's heavyweight champion. Muhammad Ali would then become the world heavyweight champion in 1964 and 1974 and 1978, making him the first fighter to capture the heavyweight title on 3 separate occasions. In 1981, Muhammad Ali retired from professional boxing and dedicated his life to promoting world peace and fighting for civil rights and hunger relief and just basic human values. His humanitarian work included helping to secure the release of 15 U.S. hostages. Many of my colleagues may have forgotten about that, but Muhammad Ali helped to release 15 U.S. hostages held in Iraq during the first Gulf War, 4 hostages held in Lebanon, and conducting goodwill missions to Afghanistan and to Cuba. Muhammad Ali even had the distinct honor of traveling to South Africa to meet Nelson Mandela following President Mandela's release from prison. Ali received numerous awards in his life following his boxing career, including being inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame, receiving the Arthur Ashe Award for Courage by ESPN, the Essence Living Legend Award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2005 by then-President George W. Bush, and the footage of that ceremony has been all over the news for the last few days, and I would encourage all of my colleagues to look at it if you haven't. He was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2005 by President George W. Bush, and the Otto Hahn Peace Medal for his work with the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and the United Nations. Mr. Speaker and Mr. Yarmouth, I've used enough time this evening. I thank you again I will simply close. I cannot close like my friend Congressman Greg Meeks did a moment ago. That was a masterpiece, and I cannot wait to see the video of his closing on another day. It was extraordinary. But I will conclude by saying that Muhammad Ali, the greatest of all time, was not only a champion in the boxing ring, but a champion of human rights and civil rights, who during a difficult time in our nation's history stood on principle to end racism and bigotry in this country. Muhammad Ali, we love you. May God bless you. May God bless your family. To the fans of Muhammad Ali all across the world, thank you for supporting this great American, and thank you for allowing us to come into your homes and be a part of this tribute this evening. Thank you, Mr. Yarmuth. I yield back.
I thank you, Mr. Butterfield, and I'd now like to yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
I want to thank both of my colleagues for allowing me to come before this body to speak on behalf of the people of the city of Chicago, the people of the 1st Congressional District.
I got pictures.
Mr. Speaker, I must say that although Muhammad Ali was and is a native of Louisville, that's his birthplace, but I must also claim that Chicago is his adopted city. He spent many, many years in Chicago, bought a home on South Kenwood Avenue in my district. And as a young man, Mr. Speaker, young civil rights activist myself, I can't even express the pride that I had when I would travel down the street and point out to my young sons and anybody else who was with me that that's where Muhammad Ali lives. He was a man of the neighborhoods in Chicago. He touched many people, young people, old people, people who didn't necessarily share his same political or religious ideas, but he touched them anyhow. Mr. Speaker, Muhammad Ali was a man for all seasons. Yes, he achieved prominence in the boxing arena, in the sweet science of boxing, but he achieved greatness because of the life that he led both inside boxing and outside of boxing. Mr. Speaker, on Saturday afternoons, many of us who had few heroes would gather around television sets and watch Muhammad Ali fight in the heavyweight division against other fighters and other boxers. And when his predictions came true, when he defeated and knocked out his opposition in the time that he said he would. And there was a collective cheer and that you could hear throughout the neighborhoods of Chicago. He meant something to me. He meant something to others. Muhammad Ali not only achieved and worked hard and sacrificed for excellence, but he also inspired excellence in others. Muhammad Ali would walk down some of the main thoroughfares in Chicago, 47th Street, 79th Street, Madison Avenue. Walk down those streets and the crowds would just gather around him and follow him. And his beam in his eyes and the halo and the charisma that he had just made for an exciting time, a grand time for all of us. Mr. Speaker, Muhammad Ali not only was a great boxer, but he was indeed a man for all times. Look at his following, not just in Louisville, not just on the south and west sides of Chicago, but all across the nation, all across the world, foreign countries, African countries specifically, the same kind of enthusiasm that he inspired, the same kind of reverence that he inspired to the young men and young women in Chicago. You can see that same kind of inspiration rear up in the Congo, in Nigeria, in Zaire, in other places all across the world. Mr. Speaker, when he retired, I remember as a freshman here in Congress, when we had a session and we honored the 50 greatest athletes of all time, of the century rather. And here was some great athletes. But the one who I wanted to be with, the one who I was most excited about, the one who I wanted to be photographed with, was only Muhammad Ali. Bart Starr, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, many, many others was here. But Muhammad Ali was here. And he kind of sucked the air out of the room. Later, Mr. Speaker, when I chaired the annual legislative conference for the dinner, the gala, chaired the gala, I was so honored that he came to accept an award from the Congressional Black Caucus with his lovely wife, Alani. Another great time, another great memory. But Mr. Speaker, those who are here, the greatest honor, the greatest moment of inspiration, my most profound memory of Muhammad Ali was when he refused to go to fight in the Vietnam War. I think, in my humble opinion, had he just been a great champion, we've had other great champions who are African American. Jack Johnson, Sugar Ray Robinson, many others who were great champions. But Muhammad Ali wasn't just a boxer. He didn't just inspire others to take up boxing. I was a political activist in the 60s. And Muhammad Ali spoke to the quintessential aspect of all my activism when he said, hell no, I won't go. Hell no, I won't go. No Vietnamese have ever called me the N-word, and he said it. I don't want to say it on the floor, but he said it. And Mr. Speaker, from that moment on, he solidifies his appeal, his essence, his relationships. He solidified himself with all the struggling people of the world, of the nation, of the world. Let me just say this. I thought about Muhammad Ali when I heard of his death, and I thought of trying to recapture some of my memories of him, how he walked, his God, how he talked. Remember his size. Remember the face that was also a beautiful face. He was proud of how he looked. But Mr. Speaker, I guess what inspired me most about Muhammad Ali was how he did not surrender his faith, surrender his belief, surrender his core values to that U.S. Selective Service which drafted him. And just
If
think
the
about
gentleman
it.
would yield for a second, we need to
All right.
close down. We got another
one more
speaker,
time.
Mr. Rush.
One other thing. Mr. Speaker, I just want, and thank you so much. I don't remember the names of the men who were on that Selective Service Committee. I don't remember anything about them. They thought that they was destroying the people's champ, but they could not destroy the people's champ. He rose even above all those people who were officially appointed to bring him down. Nobody could knock out Muhammad Ali in a real sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. I'd now like to yield to the gentlelady from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee.
I thank the gentleman from Kentucky for yielding, and I thank all of my friends. We are friends, and we come to celebrate someone as potent, powerful, and certainly symbolic, but we should really recognize that the greatest, Muhammad Ali, who had many homes, and many of us can claim having had the privilege of him walking through many of our streets. He was husband, father, grandfather, son of all of his family members that loved him. And so today I offer my deepest sympathy to his beautiful wife who worked so hard to create the Muhammad Ali Center, all of his children who gained the magnificent talents in many different forms and capacities, to be able to now not only suffer this loss, but mourn someone who probably in their life created such a space for so many years. And I rise today to join in celebrating, for that's what I'd like to do, the people's champion, truly the voice of a generation advocating for the ending of inequality regarding African Americans, but as well, I believe he stood for opposing injustices all around the world. The three-time world heavyweight boxing champion helped define the turbulent times in which he reigned as the most charismatic and controversial sports figure of the 20th century. We all know that he was born Cassius Marcellus Clay, and over the past 30 years, he had his own boxing battle. And I believe that time after time, he knocked out Parkinson's disease because he lived with it, he let others know they could live with it, and he worked every day to support the advocacy groups who were trying to battle Parkinson. I'm reminded of the gold medal at the 1960 Olympics game in Rome and being crowned the world heavyweight champion so many times. But as I watched him over these past years, the admiration and affection and respect grew much more, looking at him as the iconic figure, the real spirit of can-do, the best of America, a man whose faith was very special to him, so much so that he was a conscientious objector, which was not understood, and that Selective Service Board was right in Houston, Texas. He walked those streets, his case was tried there, and victory came because he refused to yield on his principles. As one of his noteworthy opponents, Floyd Patterson, told author David Remnick some years ago, "I came to see that I was a fighter while he was history." All of his banter with United States presidents and world leaders alike, verbally sparring with musical greats, the Beatles, shaking hands with Mother Teresa. His greatest triumph lies in his legacy as a champion, a leader, a social activist, and a humanitarian, but also a mentor by distance of so many boys and girls, particularly our young men. In my own hometown, a young boxer by the name of Eric Carr first met him with one of our great sports figures, Lloyd Wells, down at the Hyatt Regency. And he said when the champ met him, the champ treated him like a longtime friend, played around with him, maybe boxed or two. I may be adding something to it, but Eric Carr today, who went on, it was in the boxing beginnings of his life, told him he wanted to be a champ just like him. Eric Carr went on to win boxing championships, but he will always remember how real Muhammad Ali was. Let me say that as he fought for the future he envisioned that we all would enjoy, I love to hear the bantering because it was wisdoms of a philosopher. His greatest triumph, as I indicated, was the humanitarianism. At the apex of his career, lauded for his unparalleled physique and mesmerizing move. I wish I could do a few of those right now. But he was more than the sum total of his athletic gifts, his agile mind, buoyant personality, brash self-confidence. Wouldn't you love him? I often remember some of those words that he said. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. His hands can hit what his eyes can't see. Now you see me, now you don't. George thinks he will, but I know he won't. Don't count the days, make the days count. I'm young, I'm handsome, I'm fast, I can't possibly be beat. But then he said, service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth. And so his inspiration continues. And I would often say that as he lived his life, we took joy. As I close, Mr. Speaker, let me offer you these words, and let me thank him for the life that he has lived. Let me borrow from Shakespeare and say that of Muhammad Ali. He was a man, taken for all in all. We shall not look upon his like again. May the greatest rest in peace. Thank you so very much, Mr. Speaker, and my colleagues for yielding to me. I still see that float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Muhammad Ali, again, rest in peace.
I thank the gentlelady, and I just yield briefly once again to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. There's so much been said appropriately about Muhammad Ali. People in this era might not realize that when he was fighting, all of America really looked forward to his fights and watched them. And the eyes of the nation were glued to the television. And see him fight and to see afterwards Howard Cosell speak in the sports, talk to him and review those fights. He was a lot about Louisville, and there's a street in Louisville for him, Muhammad Ali Boulevard, the Ali Center. Nobody carries on and will carry on Muhammad Ali's love of Louisville more than you, Mr. Yarmouth. I appreciate your having this hour. He was to Louisville in such a great way, and he's a great man to America, and thank you for putting this hour together.
I'd like to yield briefly to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Yarmouth, for hosting this hour. Muhammad Ali was a good friend. He was someone that I've known, that I've worked on some projects with. But more than that, my husband was one of those athletes. My husband was then the linebacker for the Cleveland Browns when Bill Russell and my husband, Sidney Williams, and Jim Shorter, and all of them got together to support Muhammad Ali when, of course, he was not allowed to be a conscientious objector and was threatened with prison. And so these athletes all got together. I got to know him sometime after that, and we used his home for some very special events. I got to know his wife, Veronica, and his children. One of his children worked in one of my programs. And so this comes at a very difficult time for all of us. I loved him because he had courage. He had the courage to give up his career, had the courage to threaten to be imprisoned, had the courage to fight, and the Nation of Islam stood with him. These athletes all stood with him. He was a great man. And when he said he was the greatest, he really was, because he was unusual, extraordinary. I will be at the funeral on Friday. I will be there with the family and the rest of the athletes that are still living that are going to be there to honor him. And I thank you for this time, and I yield back the balance of the time you've allotted me. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady, and a quick comment once again from Ms. Lee.
Let me just thank Mr. Yarmouth and only say I couldn't leave the mic without acknowledging that George Foreman is in Houston, Evander Holyfield, only to say that the people that he fought became his dear friends. And I know they would want me to say that. And thank you so very much for allowing us to pay tribute to the greatest.
Absolutely. I thank you very much. And as we wrap up this tribute to the life of Muhammad Ali, I just want to express what I know all of my colleagues would feel, and that is our outpouring of love and support for Lonnie, his wife of 25 years, and his many children and his extended family. Lonnie's love and dedication inspired and energized Ali even when his body was failing him, and I know that the hearts of this body as well as the world go out to her and the rest of Muhammad Ali's family. May he rest in peace, and I thank him as on behalf of everyone for his great contributions to humanity. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announcement.